Before temples were built, before laws were written, before gods were carved in stone, there were marks on skin, lines etched in flesh with bone and ash, symbols pressed into the body by thorn and fire, stories told not in books, but in blood. The oldest tattoos ever discovered belong to a man frozen in time. Ötzi, the Iceman, over 5,000 years old, lay preserved in glacial silence, his skin still bearing dark blue lines across his joints and spine. Not random, not decorative, intentional, energetic, aligned with meridians long before acupuncture would name them. He was not alone. In the mountains of Siberia, warriors were buried with swirling ink woven over their limbs, stylized beasts, serpents, guardians. In the tombs of Egypt, priestesses bore tattoos in sacred patterns, marks of devotion, fertility, and divine service. In Polynesia, entire bodies were turned into maps of memory, strength, lineage. The skin became scripture. Across every ancient culture, tattooing was not fashion. It was function. It was sacred. These marks were not made lightly. They were rites. To be tattooed meant something had shifted inside you, a threshold crossed, a vision seen, a bond made between flesh and spirit. And the process was never easy. It required pain, stillness, intention. The old tools were not gentle. Bone needles, obsidian shards, carved thorns. The ink itself soot, plant dye, sometimes even ground bone mixed with fat or blood. But that was the point. The pain was part of the prayer. The body had to be broken open just enough so the symbol could enter not just through the skin, but into the soul. And the ink? It wasn't just pigment. It was offering. It carried meaning. It was alchemical. To mark the body was to make a covenant with the invisible, to call forth energy, to seal protection, to anchor transformation into form. In many tribes, the first tattoo was received only after an initiation, a vision quest, a successful hunt, a spiritual breakthrough. You did not wear a mark until you earned it. Because once inked, you were changed not just by appearance, but by energy. These ancient people knew something we have forgotten, that the body is not a canvas. It is a gateway, and the skin is not a wall. It is a veil between worlds. So to pierce that veil with sacred purpose was to imprint not just image, but power. Power to remember, power to protect, power to become. These were not marks of vanity. They were maps of identity, codes of initiation, living prayers in motion. And when the firelight danced across those ancient tattoos, it wasn't just art that was revealed, it was memory. Memory of who we are when spirit and body are not separate. Memory of when the skin still spoke. Memory of when every scar was sacred. Every symbol speaks, even in silence. A spiral is not just a shape, it is a story. A dot is not just a point, it is a seed. A line across the skin is a direction, a current, a flow of meaning etched in time. Long before alphabets, humans understood the language of form, and tattoos were the body's way of remembering what words could never hold. Across oceans, deserts, and forests, people who had never met carved the same marks, the same spirals, the same triangles, the same circles around the navel, the heart, the spine. How? Because these symbols were not invented. They were seen in dreams, in trance, in vision, pulled from the invisible realm and anchored into flesh. Each one carried a specific vibration, Each one opened a doorway to protection, power, healing, memory. In Polynesia, a warrior's tattoos were a layered script telling stories of ancestry, trial, and spirit guardians. To read his body was to read his soul. The placement of each line mattered. The shape of every curve resonated with purpose. In the Amazon, geometric tattoos were given by shamans to those who walked between worlds. They were not decorations. They were sigils, protective grids encoded on the body to help the traveler return from the other side intact. In West Africa, sacred scarification patterns mirrored cosmological maps, spirals of the soul, rhythms of the earth, stars traced across skin. Even in Celtic lands, blue woad tattoos coiled across warriors' bodies like serpents. But these were not symbols of war alone. They were prayers, boundaries, invocations. Symbols that spoke to spirit as much as to man. Because the body was never just the body. It was a temple, and every symbol on it was a sacred glyph. You didn't just choose a design. The design chose you. Through dream, through ceremony, through vision from the elders. Some symbols called protection, others amplified power. Some calmed the storm within, others opened the door to higher states of awareness. But all of them had meaning. Today, we tattoo without knowing. We borrow symbols like fashion mandalas, sigils, tribal lines stripped from their roots. But in the old ways, to wear a symbol without purpose was to invite confusion, because symbols are alive. They vibrate, they speak, they interact with your energy field. And when placed with sacred intent at the right time, in the right place, with the right symbol, they become more than art. They become talismans, they become contracts, they become living parts of you. Because symbols do not belong to culture, they belong to consciousness. And the ancients knew. To mark the body with the right symbol is to awaken something sleeping within. A memory, a power, a path. Your body becomes the scroll, the ink becomes the key. And when the time is right, the symbol speaks. Pain has always been the gate, not because suffering is sacred, but because only through discomfort does something real emerge. And the ancients knew, to mark the body was to walk through fire, not metaphorical, not poetic, but real, visceral, undeniable pain, the sting of bone needles, the slow grind of ash and pigment into raw flesh, the breath held, the blood offered. This was not violence. This was a ritual, because pain is a threshold. To receive a sacred tattoo was never just about the image. It was about the becoming, the cracking open of the self, so that something older, something deeper, could step through. In many traditions, tattooing was the final stage of initiation, the moment when the initiate, tested through trials, fasts, isolation, and vision, came forward to be marked not by choice, but by readiness. It was never easy. There was no numbing, no machines, no sterile rooms. Only the fire, the earth, the chanting of elders, and the steady rhythm of the hand that knew where to pierce. And with each stroke of the needle, something happened, not just to the skin, but to the soul. Because the pain stripped away the noise, it silenced the ego, it shattered the illusion of control. And in its place came focus, surrender, clarity. This is why so many describe the experience of traditional tattooing as trance. The pain becomes a drumbeat, the breath becomes a prayer, the body becomes light. And when the session ends, you are no longer who you were. Not because of the ink, but because of what you endured to receive it. The pain was the passage, the proof, the alchemy. It burned away what no longer served. It made room for the new form to enter. In Polynesia, the tattoo was called tatau, the sound of the tapping, the pulse of transformation. In ancient Thailand, monks bled sacred symbols into their skin while chanting mantras, sealing the pain with protection. Among Arctic peoples, tattoos were applied not just with ink, but with breath and fire, each dot a pact with spirit. And it was always earned. The more sacred the mark, the deeper the pain. Because only through sacrifice could power be made real. Only through endurance could meaning be imprinted. And only through the opening of the flesh could the inner self come forth. This is why tattooing was respected, why it was feared, why it was never casual. Because to be tattooed was to say, I am ready to carry this. I am ready to hold this energy on my body forever. It was a promise to yourself, to the spirit world, to the path that now awaited. The mark would fade, the blood would dry, the skin would heal. But the transformation, that remained. Because once you crossed the fire of the needle, you were no longer the same. There is a deeper body beneath the skin, a body made not of muscle or bone, but of current of breath, vibration, and frequency. The ancients called it by many names. In India, the pranic field. In China, the meridian system. Among shamans, the luminous body. But they all agreed, the body is not just matter, it is energy. And every tattoo placed upon it was placed with that in mind. These were not random designs. They were interventions, calibrations, energetic implants designed to awaken, protect, or realign. The ancients knew where the lines of force ran. They knew which points were gates, which were centers of power, of memory, of spirit. So they marked them, deliberately, ritually, as one might press a sigil onto a sacred altar. A mark on the spine could open the central channel, allowing the life force to flow upward. A tattoo on the heart center might strengthen courage, compassion, or break ancestral grief. A dot beneath the navel could stabilize the root. A symbol over the third eye could ignite visions, dreams, knowing. These weren't guesses. They were techniques refined over generations of observation, of transmission, of trance. In Polynesia, tattoo placement along joints and vertebrae was believed to channel the life force directly through the movement of the body. In Borneo, tattoos on the hands and forearms were guides not only for the living, but for the soul's passage into the next world. In the Philippines, the Kalinga warriors wore chest tattoos that aligned with the energetic breath, turning the torso into both shield and transmitter. They understood the body not as a surface, but as a circuit. Ink then became not just art but code, a symbolic frequency embedded into key access points, not to beautify but to modify, to upgrade, to fortify. And the results were felt. Tattooing a symbol in the wrong place could disturb the energy field. It could distort the current, invite imbalance, misfire intent. This is why placement was sacred, chosen through vision, dream, elder guidance. The practitioner was not just an artist. They were a navigator of energy, a ritual technician who could see beyond the skin into the blueprint of the soul. And this is what we have forgotten, that your body is a living grid, and what you place upon it echoes through it. Today, we choose tattoos by whim, but the ancient way asks, what do you need to activate? What part of you longs to awaken? And where does that truth live in your body? Because once marked, the symbol does not just rest, it radiates. It becomes part of your field. It sings its vibration into your system every moment, silently, subtly, consistently. And if chosen well, it heals, it protects, it evolves you. This is not superstition. This is energetic architecture. And the body, your body, was always the temple, waiting to be inscribed not with fashion, but with purpose. To wear a sacred tattoo was never passive. It was to become a vessel for force, to house a symbol that moved, that lived, that watched. In the ancient world, tattoos were more than identity. They were armor. Not armor of steel, but of spirit, a shield of intention drawn into the skin itself. Because the spirit world is not empty. It is full of presences, of memories, of energies that move through the unseen. And those who walked close to that world, warriors, shamans, priests, needed protection. But not from the outside, from within, from doubt, from fear, from fragmentation, from the forces that eat away at integrity. And so they marked themselves, not to be seen but to be sealed. Each tattoo became a guardian, a blade, a prayer in the shape of a symbol. In Polynesia, warriors received sacred marks before entering battle, not only to intimidate, but to activate. The designs called forth strength, resilience, ancestral guidance. The marks glowed with meaning when blood was spilled, a fusion of flesh and myth. Among the Norse, runic tattoos etched onto the body were considered living spells, protections against chaos, curses, the unknown. These weren't decorative. They were chosen through ritual, inscribed by seers and skalds. In Southeast Asia, Sakyan tattoos were and still are given by monks in ceremony, each symbol empowered through breath, mantra, and sacred intent. The tiger for courage, the yantra for invincibility, the spell whispered into the ink, into the wound, into the soul. These were not metaphors, they were contracts. Because to carry a tattoo of power meant responsibility. It could not be worn casually. It had to be earned. To receive a sacred mark before you were ready was dangerous. The energy could overwhelm. The spirit within the symbol could turn on the unprepared. So the elders waited. They watched. They marked only those who had crossed the fire and returned with open hands. And these tattoos were not just protective. They were keys. Some unlocked memory, ancestral, collective, cosmic. Some opened vision, dream sight, animal instinct, divine communion. Others awakened gifts buried deep within intuition, speech, strength, stillness. But always they shifted something. Because the tattoo was a tuning fork. It vibrated through the body, through the energy field, recalibrating the person who wore it. In the wrong hands, this was dangerous. That is why, in many traditions, tattoo knowledge was kept secret, guarded, initiated. It was not fashion. It was a weapon, a sacred one. And today, we are only beginning to remember that when you mark your body with power, your body responds. Your life bends around it. Doors open or close. Synchronicities unfold. Because ink, placed with sacred intent, becomes more than design. It becomes spell. It becomes armor. It becomes a voice your soul never forgets. There was a time when to wear sacred ink was an act of reverence, and then, suddenly, it became a crime. Not because it lost its meaning, but because it held too much. Because ink, when placed with power, made people ungovernable. It made them rooted in something deeper than law, older than empire. It made their bodies holy. And that was intolerable. So the war on tattoos began. not in battlefields, but in temples, in forests, in colonized hearts. Across continents, sacred tattoos were outlawed, erased, and demonized, not by accident, but by design. In Polynesia, missionaries arrived not only with Bibles, but with razors, forcing warriors to abandon their marks, calling them pagan, sinful, primitive. Entire traditions were lost in a generation. Symbols that once spoke to the gods were silenced by decree. In the Philippines, colonizers targeted the Kalinga tattooed elders women, whose bodies told the stories of lineage, love, and survival. They were shamed, hidden, labeled as backwards relics of a savage past. In North and South America, indigenous tattoo ceremonies were forbidden, seen as barbaric by settlers who could not understand that the lines were prayers, that the ink was memory, that the pain was a language of the soul. Even in Europe, the old traditions were burned away. Before the cathedrals, before the crowns, Celtic and Nordic tribes bore sacred markings, spirals, knots, runes of protection. But when the empire came, they were driven underground. The body had to be clean. The spirit had to belong to the state. Because to mark the body with your own meaning, to inscribe your truth onto your skin, was an act of sovereignty. It said, "My body is mine. My spirit is mine. My path is not yours to control." And this was the true threat. Not the ink, but the memory it carried. The empire wanted souls that forgot, souls that obeyed, souls that looked to outside authority for meaning. So tattoos became criminal. Marked bodies were associated with thieves, outcasts, rebels. Even today, the shadow of that conditioning remains, whispers that tattoos are dangerous, dirty, unprofessional. But what they're really saying is, this body does not belong to the system. This body speaks another language. This skin remembers what cannot be controlled. And that is powerful. Because despite the centuries of erasure, the ink did not die. It went quiet. It went underground. It waited in bloodlines, in bones, in dreams. And now it rises again, not as fashion, but as a call. A call to remember that the skin is not neutral, that it is not theirs to define, that every mark you choose when chosen in truth is a declaration. I remember who I am, and no empire can erase that. Something ancient is rising beneath the surface of skin. It begins quietly in the pull toward a symbol, a dream you can't forget, a shape that returns again and again, asking to be marked upon the body. It isn't fashion, it's memory. You may not know why, but your soul remembers. Remembers the way your ancestors sat in circle, breath steady, heart open, as ink met flesh, not with haste, but with reverence. Remembers the pain not as punishment, but as passage. Remembers that the body was never just yours, it was a scroll. Now that remembrance is awakening again. Not in temples, not in textbooks, but in the quiet hunger for meaning. More and more, people are returning to the ink, but differently, not for trends, not to decorate, but to reclaim. They ask deeper questions. What is this symbol? Where should it live on my body? What does it activate? What does it protect? This is the return of sacred tattooing, not as replication of the old, but as living ritual. Tattoo artists become once again what they were meant to be: ritualists, guides, initiators. The needle becomes an instrument of ceremony. The studio becomes a temple. And the act of being tattooed becomes prayer. It begins with intention, not just what to wear, but why. What chapter are you closing? What energy are you anchoring? What are you ready to claim? Then comes the symbol not just chosen from a flash sheet, but discovered in meditation, in dreams, in visions that rise from within. Then the body speaks. Here, it says, place it here, not randomly, but where the current moves, where the transformation longs to root. And then the pain, the gift, the ritual burn that opens the gate. Tears fall, silence deepens, the mark takes shape, and with it, something ancient returns. You are no longer the same. You walk out not with a tattoo, but with a reminder of who you were before forgetting, of what you carry, of what you've become. Because sacred tattooing is not about expression, it's about alignment. It's about bringing the inner world into form so that your skin becomes a visible map of your invisible truth. This is the spiritual reawakening of ink, not a revival, a remembering. And once remembered, it cannot be undone. The ink lives with you, speaks through you, evolves as you evolve. It's not a statement, it's a vibration. And when worn with reverence, it becomes a beacon for the ancestors, for the future, for the self you are still becoming. You were taught that temples are built from stone, that sacred spaces exist outside you, high on mountains, deep in forests, hidden in ruins. But the oldest temple has no walls. It breathes, it bleeds, it carries you through every moment of your life. It is your body. And every sacred tattoo ever inked was a recognition of that truth. That the body is not a machine, it is not a prison, it is a map, a scroll, a living altar for the divine. To mark it with intention is to light a flame within the flesh, to claim your own form as holy, to remember that transformation does not happen in the clouds, it happens here, in this skin, in this breath. The ancients knew this. They did not separate spirit from flesh. They knew the body was a doorway, and tattoos were keys. To wear a sacred mark was to say, this body is my temple, this life is my ritual, and I choose to walk it awake. Today, that remembrance is rising again in dreamers, mystics, artists, warriors of the unseen. They no longer tattoo just to be seen. They tattoo to remember, to connect, to activate what has been waiting beneath the surface. Because when you mark your body with truth, you do more than express, you declare that you are not asleep, that you are not hiding, that you are ready to live in alignment with what your soul already knows. So choose wisely, listen deeply, let the symbol find you. And when it does, don't rush. Sit with it, breathe with it, speak to the place on your body where it longs to live, and then, when the moment comes, receive it, fully, consciously, gratefully. Because it's not just a tattoo, it's a passage, it's a vow, it's a door back into the sacred. And once you walk through it, you don't go back. Because the temple is awake now, the altar is lit, and the body you carry is no longer just yours. It is memory, it is myth, it is living ceremony. And every mark upon it is a star in the map of your becoming.